It wasn't until I saw my husband's marriage certificate with my sister-in-law that I finally understood why he had never agreed to register our marriage. I lost control and demanded an explanation like a madwoman. My sister-in-law covered her face, choking back sobs, refusing to speak, while my husband impatiently snapped, "Don't make it sound so bad. There's no blood relation between Emily and me. Besides, you and I never got legally married. If we're being precise, you're the mistress here." Even the bratty children rolled their eyes at me. "Come on, get over it already. You were never good enough for my father in the first place. They are legally married. Because of you, they couldn't even be together openly. They're the real victims here." His words hit me so hard that I had a heart attack, yet not a single person came to my aid. When I opened my eyes again, my husband was still repeating his excuse about not registering our marriage. But this time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a broom and drove them both out of the house. Then, without looking back, I walked straight to the house next door. Looking at the man standing in front of me, I asked, "Does our engagement still count?" "Hey, sister-in-law? Whether we register the marriage or not, it doesn't matter. In my heart, you'll always be my sister-in-law, and in my brother's heart, you're his one and only love. Isn't that enough? Besides, once we hold the wedding banquet, everyone for miles around will know you're his wife. They'll call you the college student's wife. Isn't that prestigious enough? Why insist on a legal marriage certificate?" My soon-to-be sister-in-law, Lisa Carter, held my hand and spoke gently. Meanwhile, my fiancé, Mark Carter, sat beside her, his expression filled with impatience. But their eyes gleamed with the same anticipation, waiting for me to nod. As I looked at this all-too-familiar scene, I froze. Wasn't I dead? Feeling stiff, I turned my head toward the mirror nearby. The reflection staring back at me was that of a young woman in her early 20s, not the hunched, exhausted old woman in her 50s I had been before. At that moment, everything became clear. I had been reborn. In my past life, I had been persuaded by Lisa's heartfelt words to forgo registering the marriage. Instead, I had agreed to a small wedding banquet and foolishly married Mark. After marrying him, I first supported him through college. A few years later, I even paid for Lisa's education. I spent my days serving them like a nanny and later gave birth to 2 outstanding children for Mark. But it wasn't until 30 years later that I discovered the truth. Mark and Lisa weren't actually blood-related siblings. They had been legally married behind my back while pretending to be siblings in public. I had spent my entire life sacrificing for them, only to end up being labeled as the mistress and literally dying from anger. At that thought, I wanted nothing more than to grab a freshly bought kitchen knife and chop them into pieces. But I held back. First, being reborn wasn't easy. Second, I wasn't strong enough to take them on. So instead, I simply yanked my hand away from Lisa's grip and let out a cold scoff. Fine, no marriage certificate then. Both Lisa and Mark looked pleased, but before they could say another word, I sneered and added, "Not that it matters. It's not like I have to marry into your family." "What do you mean by that?" Mark frowned and stood up, his face full of mockery. "Are you playing hard to get? Do you think this is funny? Do you know how many girls are lining up for me? I haven't even considered them because I've always chosen you. And now, just because of a marriage certificate, you're making a fuss. I'm telling you, Anna Foster, do you even know your worth? You're an orphan. I'm a college student willing to marry you. You should be grateful. If anyone is settling here, it's me, not you." I wasn't surprised by Mark's confidence. After all, he was undeniably handsome. Even though he had terrible grades and came from a poor family, he had somehow managed to get into college, bringing honor to his family. Even though my family was well off, I had spent the past 2 years shamelessly chasing after Mark. I cooked for him, washed his clothes, cleaned his house, and spent a fortune on him. And he wasn't wrong. I was an orphan, without parents or family. On the marriage market, that was a disadvantage. But Mark had overlooked one crucial fact. I had money. To put it bluntly, I was the only person in the 1980s who could afford to eat meat at every meal. Without me, how could Mark and Lisa have lived so comfortably? How could they have climbed their way to success? At that thought, my expression grew even more contemptuous. They say the emperor's daughter never has to worry about getting married. While I may not be a princess, everyone knew I was the most well-off person in the entire area. No matter who I married, their family would instantly rise in status. So how exactly was Mark the one making a sacrifice? He needed to drop this pathetic act of pretending to be reluctant while shamelessly living off me. A college student like you? I scoffed. I couldn't care less. Lisa froze, then forced an awkward smile. Mark, on the other hand, snapped. Lisa, we're leaving. Don't waste time on her. Then, before walking out, he shot me a smug look. Just wait, within 3 days, she'll come begging me for forgiveness. Sure, I need her money, but without me, she won't be able to hold on to it either. With that, Mark didn't give me another chance to speak. He clasped Lisa's hand tightly, their fingers interlocked, and walked away. Watching their retreating figures and their tightly held hands, I found it ridiculous. How blind had I been in my past life to not see that something was obviously wrong between them? But even as they left, I didn't feel particularly happy. Because, unfortunately, Mark wasn't wrong. Marrying him had actually been a win-win situation for both of us. It wasn't just because I had been blindly in love with him. I needed him, or more accurately, I needed to get married. When my parents passed away from illness, they left me a substantial inheritance. If this were 30 years in the future, I wouldn't have needed to marry at all. But back then, things were different. My relatives were circling like vultures, all eager to push me into an arranged marriage just so they could get their hands on my wealth. The only way to deter them was to find a husband who could intimidate them. Mark had never actually agreed to be a live-in son-in-law, but the fact that he was a college student made people wary of provoking him. In my past life, this was exactly why he and Lisa were able to manipulate me into accepting a marriage without registration. I hadn't wanted to, but in order to protect my parents' wealth, I had foolishly gone along with it. They say a man's biggest fear is choosing the wrong career, and a woman's biggest fear is marrying the wrong man. I had married the wrong man, and it had killed me. But this time, if I didn't marry Mark, then who could I marry? Setting aside whether I even wanted to marry again, who would be willing to take a woman who had previously been in a relationship while also risking the wrath of my scheming relatives and an arrogant college student? Over the next few days, Mark waited for me to apologize. Lisa, on the other hand, visited several times, likely hoping to persuade me the same way she had in my past life. But I never even opened the door. I was too overwhelmed trying to figure out what to do next to waste time arguing with her. It wasn't until I heard the sound of a dog barking from next door that something clicked in my mind. That's right, there was still him. I slaughtered a chicken, made a pot of rich chicken soup, dressed up a little, and knocked on the door of the house next door. I had planned out everything I wanted to say, but when I actually stood there in front of him, my face burned with embarrassment, and I couldn't get the words out. After a long pause, I finally managed to ask, "Does our engagement still count?" The man in front of me, Jacob Miller, was momentarily stunned. He scratched his head in confusion. "Our engagement? You mean, you should know, right? We were betrothed as children." I bit my lip and nodded. "Even though our parents are gone now, the engagement was real. You do remember it, don't you?" For the past few days I had been racking my brain, trying to think of a way out. But no matter how hard I thought, I couldn't come up with a solution until I heard Jacob's dog barking and suddenly remembered him. Jacob had been my childhood neighbor. Our parents had been close friends, and when we were still in our mother's wombs, they had jokingly promised to arrange our marriage. I never disliked Jacob, but I had always thought of myself as a modern woman, not someone stuck in the past. If I was going to get married, I wanted it to be my own choice, so I had stubbornly refused to acknowledge the engagement. Our parents had only been joking in the first place, so when I rejected it, they didn't push the matter. Then, after Jacob's parents passed away, and with society increasingly emphasizing free marriage, the engagement became nothing more than an old anecdote. But this time, I had given it serious thought. Jacob and I had grown up together. I knew his character well. In my past life, I had suffered greatly with Mark, but Jacob had once stood up for me. Unfortunately, not long after, he had drowned himself in the river. If I could marry Jacob, I wouldn't just be saving myself, I might even be able to save him too. It would be the perfect solution for both of us. I handed the bowl of chicken soup to him and said softly, "Trust me, marrying me is not a loss." I had prepared a whole speech, ready to continue persuading him, but before I could say anything else, Jacob simply smiled and nodded. "All right, then let's get married." Huh? I was momentarily stunned. Without hesitation, Jacob placed the bowl of chicken soup back into my hands. "You should drink this. You've seemed restless these past few days, and you've lost weight." I reached up to touch my face. Have I really lost weight? I didn't even notice. In my past life, Mark had constantly told me I was too fat, that my face was too round, and had forced me to eat less and drink less. I had always believed I was overweight, but now I finally realized that in the eyes of someone who genuinely cared about me, I was actually quite thin. I drank the chicken soup in one go. I didn't know if it was because of my tears, but it tasted a little salty. After finishing the soup, I didn't want to waste any time. I immediately pulled Jacob along with me to register our marriage. In no time, we had our marriage certificate in hand. Looking at my name printed on the certificate, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. I had spent my entire past life longing for this piece of paper, and now that I finally had it, I couldn't stop my tears from falling. Jacob was startled. "Why are you crying? If you regret this, you don't have to force yourself. We can get a divorce right away. I'll just say I used our childhood engagement to pressure you into marrying me." I cried even harder. Panicking, Jacob quickly added, "If you're worried about Mark misunderstanding, I can explain everything to him." I shook my head. "No, that's not it. I'm just happy." Of course, there was some regret as well. Regret that in my past life, I had never appreciated Jacob's kindness. Wiping away my tears, I looked at him seriously and said, "From now on, you have to listen to me about everything. If something happens, you must tell me. Don't keep things bottled up, and don't ever do anything reckless." Jacob nodded immediately. We didn't go home right away. Instead, we started making arrangements for the wedding. We split up to handle different tasks. One of us went around spreading the news and inviting guests, while the other took care of setting up the banquet. Before long, the entire town knew I was getting married. In this era, opportunities to enjoy a feast were rare, so everyone was eagerly looking forward to the celebration. News of my wedding banquet quickly reached Mark and Lisa. So, while I was out borrowing tables and chairs, the two of them suddenly appeared in front of me, blocking my path. Mark crossed his arms and smirked. "Didn't you say you weren't going to marry me? And yet here you are, obediently preparing for a wedding banquet." I frowned, about to reply, but he waved a hand to cut me off. "All right, no need to apologize. I'm not actually mad at you, but as punishment, the wedding banquet is canceled." As soon as he finished speaking, Lisa stepped forward with a sweet smile. "Anna, it's not that we're canceling the banquet. We just think it should be a bit smaller. Think about it, Mark just started college, and if he makes too much of a scene, people will talk. And besides, hosting such a grand banquet is expensive. Mark's education is going to cost a lot of money, and you two will have children in the future. You'll have expenses everywhere. It's better to tell the guests not to come and just keep it between close family members." I couldn't hold it in anymore. I sat down on a nearby chair and sneered. "Mark Carter, Lisa Carter, are you two insane? I'm spending my own money. What does that have to do with you? And Mark's tuition? What does that have to do with me? He's not my son. Am I supposed to support him too?" I looked at Lisa with disgust. "And don't call me sister-in-law anymore. This wedding banquet and I have nothing to do with either of you. Do you understand?" My words nearly made Mark explode with rage. His face turned red as he pointed at me. "What the hell are you saying? How could this have nothing to do with me? You're hosting a wedding banquet. I'm the groom. You and your money belong to me. How could it not be my business? Have you lost your mind?" His expression darkened as he continued. "I was going to let this go since you took the initiative to hold a wedding banquet. I was even willing to forgive you. But since you insist on acting crazy, let me make this clear. You won't see me at that wedding. I suggest you cancel it immediately. Otherwise, you'll just embarrass yourself." I didn't even have time to call him crazy before Mark once again grabbed Lisa's hand and stormed off. After that incident, Mark never came looking for me again. He probably thought I was being too arrogant, refusing to appreciate the kindness he was offering. He must have been trying to find a way to put me in my place. But Lisa? She came several times. Knowing them as well as I did, I was certain she was only acting as Mark's messenger. Every word she spoke had been rehearsed and planned by him. That's why, every time she showed up, she said the same things. Anna, my brother said he was just joking. Of course, we'll be there for the wedding banquet. But when Mark comes, you need to apologize properly. You've upset him so many times, and that was your fault. Don't think that apologizing is humiliating. Once you marry into our family, you'll be a college student's wife. Everyone will envy you. Oh, by the way, school is starting soon, so hurry up and hand over my brother's tuition fees. A fight is a fight, but you're getting married anyway, so don't let this affect his education. Every time I clearly explained that I had nothing to do with Mark anymore. But Lisa refused to believe me, convinced that I was just making excuses to force Mark into officially registering our marriage. I was busy preparing for my own wedding. After refusing to give her any money, I simply ignored her. Lisa seemed a little uneasy, but when she saw the customized lanterns I had made, decorated with both the Miller and Foster family names, she assumed I was bluffing. Eventually, she got tired of trying to persuade me and stopped coming. Soon, the wedding day arrived. People from all over town showed up. If I hadn't connected my yard with Jacob's, there wouldn't have been enough space to accommodate everyone. Halfway through the wedding banquet, Mark and Lisa finally showed up, deliberately arriving late. Seeing that the feast had already begun, Mark looked like he was about to explode. He stood at the entrance of the yard and shouted, "Anna Foster, are you insane? How did you start without me?" The moment his words fell, the guests erupted into whispers. Why is he here? Didn't they break up? If they broke up, why is he attending the wedding? This is suspicious. It doesn't make sense. Why would the bride have to wait for her ex-boyfriend before starting the banquet? Hey, look at what he's wearing. A red outfit? He looks like he's here to crash the wedding. Honestly, he really does look like the groom. Hearing the murmurs around him, Mark suddenly realized something. This wedding wasn't about him. Meanwhile, Jacob and I, dressed in our wedding attire, were standing among the guests, offering drinks and thanking everyone for coming. Mark's face twisted in disbelief. Anna, what the hell is this? I said I wasn't coming to your wedding, so you just let someone else take my place? Are you actually out of your mind? Lisa turned pale. Anna, hurry and come here. If this keeps up, my brother is really going to get angry, and I won't be able to help you. I frowned and said coldly, Mark, open your eyes. I didn't have someone take your place. I'm marrying Jacob Miller, and stop looking at me like that. You were the one who personally told me you weren't going to marry me, that we were over. We have nothing to do with each other anymore. Who I marry is none of your business. Impossible. Mark shouted, his voice filled with rage. Like a madman, he lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. How could you marry him? You love me. We already chose our wedding date. How can you just decide to marry someone else? Before I could react, Jacob stepped in and shoved Mark away, positioning himself protectively in front of me. His voice was calm but firm. If you're here to celebrate, have a seat. If you're here to cause trouble, then leave. It was the first time I had ever seen him lose his temper. Jacob had always been gentle, never once raising his voice at me. Now, he wasn't just speaking firmly, his entire demeanor had shifted. Mark hesitated, clearly intimidated, but he still didn't leave. Instead, he stood there stubbornly and said, Anna, I know I was wrong. Stop making a scene and come back to me. Get rid of him. We are the real couple. I always knew Mark was full of himself, but I never expected his confidence to reach such an absurd level. Even after everything was set in stone, he still believed I was only pretending to get married just to provoke him. He actually thought that with a simple "I was wrong," I would immediately forgive him and continue with our wedding as if nothing had happened. Absolutely delusional. I didn't bother responding to him. Instead, I walked straight into the house and returned with my marriage certificate. But I didn't show it to Mark. I handed it directly to the village chief. Village chief, can you confirm for everyone whether Jacob and I are legally married? And tell me what exactly is wrong with us hosting a wedding banquet? The village chief took a look at the certificate, then turned to Mark with a heavy sigh. Mark, Anna, and Jacob are legally husband and wife. They even had an engagement from before. Even if you like Anna, you can't act like this. A real man doesn't throw childish tantrums. The surrounding guests immediately chimed in. Yeah, Mark, just let it go. This is embarrassing for you. Mark staggered back a few steps, his eyes locked on me. Anna, do you really want me to leave? I shook my head. His face instantly lit up with hope, and Lisa let out a relieved sigh. I knew it. I knew you wouldn't. Before she could finish, I continued, you can leave, but take off the clothes you're wearing first. If I remember correctly, I made those for you. And frankly, I don't think you deserve to wear something I made. I'd rather give them to Waffles. Waffles? Mark blinked in confusion. Woof, woof. Hearing his name, my dog perked up and barked a few times. Mark's face darkened instantly, his expression twisting in fury as he finally understood. I was mocking him, saying he wasn't even as worthy as a dog. Anna Foster, you? This is too much. I scoffed. What's wrong? You're a college student, aren't you? Don't tell me you're planning to steal a set of clothes now? Mark was so furious he nearly passed out. His hands trembled as he angrily tore off the outfit and threw it to the ground. Grinding his teeth, he spat, You'll regret this. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed away, stumbling slightly as he left. Lisa hesitated for a moment but eventually ran after him. With them gone, the wedding banquet continued without any further disturbances. That night, after the guests had left, Jacob held a blanket in his arms and hesitated at the doorway. I'll sleep outside, he said. I stopped him. Jacob, I see everything you've done for me. Yes, I was in love with Mark before, but that's all in the past. We're married now. You don't have to sleep outside. He still looked unsure, probably thinking I had only married him out of spite and that I would regret it. He clutched the blanket tightly, not moving. I frowned. If you refuse to sleep in here, does that mean you didn't marry me sincerely? Are you planning to divorce me? Jacob's eyes widened, and he immediately shook his head. Without hesitation, he put the blanket back into the cabinet and shut the door firmly. That night, Jacob was incredibly gentle. I barely felt any pain at all, a stark contrast to my wedding night in my past life. Back then, Mark had been rough, nearly making me pass out from the pain. And right after, he had used the excuse of helping Lisa with her studies to leave me alone in our bedroom. Yet instead of being angry, I had foolishly dragged my aching body out of bed to make them a late-night snack. Every time I thought about it, I wanted to slap my past self. Not just my wedding night, my entire marriage this time was different. Since Jacob and I had no parents, I didn't have to wake up early to serve my in-laws like I had in my previous life. I didn't have to run around catering to Mark and Lisa. Instead, I could sleep in as long as I wanted and wake up to the breakfast that Jacob prepared for me. After living 2 lifetimes, I never imagined I would have a life this peaceful. Meanwhile, Mark's family wasn't faring so well. Just a few days later, Lisa showed up at my doorstep, her face streaked with tears. At first, I ignored her, but she cried so loudly that she had already drawn a crowd of curious neighbors. Begrudgingly, I got up and opened the door. It had only been a month since we last saw each other. Lisa looked haggard, her face even bearing visible injuries. I found it ironic. Those wounds were probably from Mark. Despite being a college student, Mark's education and character never matched his so-called status. Not only was he crude and uncultured, but he was also prone to violence. He likely blamed Lisa for not being able to marry me, so he took his frustration out on her. It was laughable. In my past life, Mark had felt guilty for marrying me and having children with me, as if he had betrayed Lisa. He treated her like some untouchable, sacred love, his white moonlight. But in this life, with me no longer being a fool in love, even his white moonlight wasn't spared from his temper. Lisa was on the verge of dropping to her knees as she pleaded, Anna, no, sister. Please, come see my brother. He's seriously ill. I beg you, just go check on him. My hatred for Lisa and Mark was the same, but since they hadn't legally married yet, I couldn't find a way to properly retaliate against them. So instead, I coldly shook off her hand. If he's sick, he should see a doctor. What does that have to do with me? I'm not a doctor. Lisa froze, clearly shocked. She had assumed that even if I had married someone else out of spite, I still loved Mark deep down. She believed that upon hearing he was sick, I would immediately rush to see him. But my indifference was the last reaction she had expected. Seeing that she wasn't leaving, I smirked. What? Don't tell me your family is out of money and you're waiting for me to pay for his doctor visit? I crossed my arms. If that's the case, you came to the wrong person. I'm not your personal cash cow. As soon as those words left my mouth, the surrounding neighbors burst into laughter. Lisa's face turned red and pale in turns. Suddenly, she yelled, "Anna Foster, how can you be so shameless? You and my brother were already discussing marriage. He rejected so many proposals for you, and just because our family had no money, you turned around and married someone else without a word? Do you not think that's cruel?" She pointed at me with trembling fingers. "Even if you didn't register the marriage, you and my brother were already a couple in the eyes of everyone. What you did is adultery. If this were ancient times, you'd be executed for this." No matter the era, accusations of infidelity were always damaging to a woman's reputation. Hearing Lisa's words, the watching neighbors couldn't help but whisper among themselves. Honestly, I always found it strange. Anna was so devoted to Mark back then. Yeah, and then out of nowhere she married Jacob instead. So it really was about money. My God, if they were already considered a married couple, then does that mean? As the gossip grew uglier, Lisa's expression turned smug. But instead of getting angry, I suddenly let out a dramatic wail and dropped to my knees in front of Lisa. "Lisa, why are you saying such awful things? I've always been good to you," I cried, grabbing her hand with a heartbroken expression. "Yes, I did date your brother, but everyone in the village knows that you were always present whenever we met. Now you're saying we were already husband and wife? What exactly are you implying? Are you suggesting that the three of us did those kinds of things together?" Lisa was just an 18-year-old girl, no match for my thick-skinned 50-year-old soul. She immediately panicked and stammered, "No, I mean, what I meant was that my family already saw you as part of it." Her words only made me cry harder. "Lisa, you were there that day when your brother broke up with me," I sobbed. "The neighbors probably heard it too. He said he was willing to marry me, but not legally register the marriage. Tell me, what was I supposed to do? Am I so unworthy that I should just settle for being a concubine in the Carter family? What? Just because he's a college student, he thinks he's entitled to 2 wives? Lisa instinctively stepped back, her confidence crumbling. "The registration could have been discussed. You didn't have to rush into marrying someone else. Rush into it?" At that moment, Jacob stepped out from the house. "Anna and I were engaged from the very beginning. Maybe your family came later and didn't know, but all the other neighbors here are well aware of it. Your brother tried to trick Anna into becoming his concubine, and when she refused, he decided to play games with her engagement. Tell me, what exactly did she do wrong?" With Jacob standing by my side, I felt even more confident. Lisa didn't dare argue anymore. Covering her face in embarrassment, she turned and ran away. The neighbors, having overheard everything, finally understood the truth. I wasn't fickle or disloyal. It was Mark who had been the one acting disgracefully. Jacob took my hand and said, "Anna, you've suffered enough. Let's go to the police and make him pay for what he's done." I was just about to nod when several neighbors quickly grabbed my hands and started persuading me. "Anna, I know you've been wronged, but Mark is a college student. He'll become an important official one day. They say ordinary people shouldn't fight with those in power. You should just let this go." That's right. Mark has always treated his sister well. You don't want to go against them and end up hurting yourself. You and Jacob might have some money, but at the end of the day, you're still just common folks. Now that everyone knows the truth, there's no need to escalate things by going to the police. Jacob's grip on my hand tightened. "Even if it means going to jail, even if it means dying, I will not let you be mistreated." I lowered my eyes. Ever since my rebirth, I had wanted nothing more than to take revenge on Mark and Lisa. But how? Should I just go around telling people about their secret relationship? Without evidence, who would believe me? After thinking it over, I ultimately decided not to let Jacob report it to the police. Instead, I pulled him inside the house and said firmly, "No, we're not going to the police. We're going to college." Jacob looked uneasy. He sighed and said, I actually already tried once, but I didn't pass the exam. Maybe I'm just not smart enough. In my past life, I had been too obsessed with Mark to notice that Jacob had even attempted the college entrance exam. Looking at his dejected face, I patted his hand reassuringly. Don't worry, if that idiot Mark could pass, then you definitely can too. Besides, we'll be studying together, keeping each other accountable. We can do this. Jacob still seemed hesitant, but as always he nodded. All right, I'll listen to you. I wasn't just talking big. In my past life, I had worked hard to study just so I could have more in common with Mark. I even took practice exams, and my scores were actually higher than his. So I had full confidence that I could pass, and if I could help Jacob pass too. As long as he wasn't completely hopeless, he had a shot. I went out and bought study materials, dividing my time between studying for myself and tutoring Jacob. It wasn't until I started teaching him that I realized just how smart he was. At this rate, we were bound to get accepted. For the next few months, Jacob and I shut out the world, focusing solely on our studies. But just a week before the new semester started, Mark and Lisa barged back into my life once again. Mark looked anxious. The moment I opened the door, he grabbed Lisa's wrist and squeezed past me into the house. Anna, I know I was wrong. I'm willing to register our marriage now. Just divorce Jacob, and we'll go get our marriage certificate. I don't care about your marriage to him. Let's just go back to how things were before, okay? I knew all too well, Mark didn't actually think he had done anything wrong. He was just putting on an act. I was speechless. What was this performance supposed to be? He was only coming back now because school was about to start, and he wanted me to pay for his tuition again. I cut straight to the point. Let me be clear, that is never going to happen. Jacob and I are very happy together. There's no way I'm divorcing him. With that, I walked over and pulled the door wide open. Get out. Don't make me say it twice. But instead of leaving, Mark and Lisa exchanged glances and gave each other a slight nod. Before I could react, Mark suddenly pulled out a knife and pressed it against my neck. At the same time, Lisa quickly shut the door. The two of them tied me to a chair. I had only been given this second chance at life. I wasn't going to waste it. So I forced myself to stay calm and spoke slowly. Mark, you worked so hard to get into college. Are you really going to throw your future away for this? My husband will be back soon. What you're doing is illegal. You should think this through. Lisa let out a cold laugh. Ha, drop the act. We saw Jacob riding out on his bike when we got here. He was in a hurry, he won't be back anytime soon. Mark frowned. Enough talking, let's get this over with. A chill ran down my spine. What exactly do you want? If it's money, but Mark didn't let me finish. Instead, he started undoing his belt. Money? I don't want your money. I want you. He sneered. As long as I sleep with you, all I have to do is tell everyone that you seduced me. Of course, they'll believe me, the college student, not you, the unfaithful woman who ran off with another man. He smirked. And when Jacob finds out, no matter how much he loves you, he'll divorce you. After that, I'll marry you, and everything you own will be mine. You'll still have to support me through school and serve me for the rest of your life. The words serve me for the rest of your life sent a wave of nausea through me. My past life flashed before my eyes like a horror show. No, no, no. I would rather die than live through that again. I started struggling frantically, screaming for help. But before I could get a full scream out, Lisa clamped a hand over my mouth. Hurry up, Mark, she urged. I was pinned down, unable to make a sound. Just as I thought it was all over, bang! The door slammed open with a loud crash. Jacob stormed in, grabbed Mark by the collar and flung him against the wall. The force sent Mark sprawling into the corner, groaning in pain. The loud noise had drawn the attention of the neighbors, and a small crowd began to gather outside. Jacob quickly took off his jacket and wrapped it around me, his voice gentle as he reassured me. It's okay, it's over now. Hearing his familiar voice, I finally let out a breath I had been holding. But as I looked down at my disheveled clothes, fear crept in. What if he misunderstood? I swear, nothing happened. You got here in time, he didn't, Jacob nodded without hesitation. I believe you, and even if something had happened, it wouldn't matter. I would only feel sorry for you. I'd never blame you, because this is my fault. I failed to protect you. Meanwhile, Mark winced in pain, clutching his side, but he didn't dare say a word. He knew he wasn't a match for Jacob in a fight, especially with so many people watching. Lisa, realizing the situation, quickly rushed to help him up. She tried to make a run for it, but the neighbors had already blocked the doorway. "Hold it right there," one of them shouted. "You two aren't going anywhere." Someone had already gone to call the village chief. When the village chief arrived, Mark straightened up and said indignantly, "Anna invited me here. We were having an affair. That's not illegal, so move aside." Lisa eagerly nodded. "Yes, she was the one who called us here. She said she missed my brother. She's the one who started this. We haven't committed any crimes." Before she could finish, the village chief cut her off. "She invited you here? Did she also ask you to bring a knife and tie her up?" He pointed at the knife still lying on the ground and the rope beside it. The onlookers murmured in agreement. "And what kind of affair involves a younger sister tagging along?" the chief scoffed. "Do you take us all for fools?" He turned to Mark, his face filled with disappointment. "You were the first college student from our county. We all had such high hopes for you. And this is how you repay us?" Jacob wrapped a protective arm around me and stepped forward. "Village chief, you saw everything. He broke into my home and tried to assault my wife. We must report this to the police." His voice was steady, but his grip on me tightened. "Even if it costs me everything, I will make sure he pays for this." The moment Mark heard the word police, he snapped. "No, you can't call the police," he shrieked. Then, in a wild panic, he grabbed a nearby wooden stool and swung it at the back of Jacob's head. I screamed, but it was too late. Jacob collapsed to the ground. My heart nearly stopped. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't afford to break down now. I forced myself not to panic. With the village chief's help, I managed to get Jacob to the hospital. Fortunately, fate was on our side this time. Although Jacob had lost a lot of blood, his injuries were not life-threatening. He was diagnosed with a mild concussion. After a few days of unconsciousness, he finally woke up. I sobbed uncontrollably beside him, overwhelmed with relief. To comfort me, Jacob smiled and said, "I had the strangest dreams while I was out. They were really interesting. But if I tell you, you have to promise not to get mad, okay?" I wiped my tears. "What dreams?" Jacob thought for a moment. "In my dream, you weren't my wife. I saw you, pregnant, with a huge belly, still working in the fields early in the morning. You were so thin it scared me, but your stomach was enormous. I felt sorry for you, so I tried to help. But instead, your husband got angry and scolded you for it." I froze. That wasn't a dream. That was something that had actually happened in my past life. I quickly asked, "And then, what else did you dream of?" Seeing that I wasn't upset, Jacob continued. "The details are blurry, but I remember getting really angry. I went to confront your husband. I think he stole something from me. I demanded that he give it back, but he refused. Then, he knocked me unconscious and threw me into the river." He chuckled. "Maybe it was you he took. Maybe I was trying to get you back." My heart clenched. Could it be that in my past life, Jacob hadn't actually committed suicide? Had Mark murdered him? A horrifying thought formed in my mind, but I didn't voice it. Instead, I made an excuse about cooking food and hurriedly left the hospital. I didn't go home. I went straight to the police station to confront Mark. The moment he saw me, he broke down in tears. "I was wrong. I was wrong. I don't want anything anymore. Please, just let me go," he begged desperately. "Anna, this wasn't my fault. It was all Lisa. She was the one who planned everything. She's the one who should take all the blame. Please, help me. If you speak on my behalf, I'll never forget your kindness. Once I graduate, I'll pay you back, I swear." I ignored his pathetic plea and demanded, "Did you steal Jacob's college acceptance letter?" Mark paled instantly. He was so terrified he confessed on the spot. It turned out that Jacob had been the one who originally passed the entrance exam. Lisa had helped Mark steal his acceptance letter, ensuring that Mark got into college instead. When Jacob later retook the exam and discovered the truth, he confronted Mark about it, only to be murdered by him. At last, I understood everything. Luckily, this time, it wasn't too late to make things right. Half a month later, Jacob had fully recovered and was finally discharged from the hospital. However, he had no memory of the dreams he had described to me before. Instead, he was shocked when I told him what had happened. Mark stole my college acceptance letter, and now he's been sentenced to death for multiple crimes? I nodded. That's right, and Lisa was sentenced to 30 years in prison for being his accomplice. It's already been decided? Jacob asked, still in disbelief. Yes. Mark and Lisa were so scared in prison that they confessed to everything, including their relationship. I sneered. Turns out they were never actually siblings. They had been secretly married all along. So not only were they punished by the law, but their parents were also completely disgraced. They had no choice but to pack up and leave town overnight. Jacob still seemed stunned, but I didn't expect someone as kind-hearted as him to react too strongly to something like this. Instead, I handed him a document. Only when he saw his own acceptance letter did it finally sink in. Holding it tightly, he suddenly hugged me and said, "Anna, you're my lucky star. If it weren't for you, I never would have known that I had passed the exam." Hearing the final verdict, I felt a strange sense of peace. Mark had ruined my entire past life and even killed Jacob. So in this life, he had to pay with his own. Lisa had kept me for 30 years, making me suffer, so she had to spend 30 years behind bars. This was karma. Not long after, Mark's death sentence was carried out. Jacob, on the other hand, finally took his rightful place as a college student. I moved with him, renting a small home near the university. With no family burdens to hold me back, I focused entirely on my studies. A year later, I passed the entrance exam and was accepted into college as well. Together, Jacob and I stepped into a future that truly belonged to us.